March 23, 1945. The west bank of the Rhine slept under a damp, heavy darkness. On the German side, the military command still repeated an old geographical certainty. The Rhine was inviolable. No enemy mechanized force had ever crossed it without building bridges, and no bridge would survive long enough under fire. For many Wehrmacht generals, this was the last defensive line, a natural border as reliable as a steel wall. But that certainty was about to unravel, because on the American side, parked in absolute silence behind the artillery line, were hundreds of vehicles that the Germans had not considered. They were trucks, but not ordinary trucks. They were DUKWs, amphibious vehicles, light, cheap, and completely underrated. And that night, they would not need bridges nor open passages. All that was needed was water. The video that begins now tells the story of a crossing that was not expected, with vehicles that did not seem threatening, but which, in a few hours, transformed geography into irrelevance and war into logistics. The Rhine, which for centuries had protected the heart of Germany, would become the channel of its silent surrender. But before we dive into the details of this invisible traversal, there is one statistic that defines the entire scale of the era. In just 3 days, more than 15,000 American troops and 3,000 tons of supplies crossed the Rhine without a single bridge, without a single visible structure. There were more than 5,000 crossings made by vehicles that the German generals had ignored in the reports, trucks that floated. While the Wehrmacht High Command waited for heavy engineering and lengthy bridges, America was already on the other side. The Rhine was not vanquished, it was ignored. And Reich, defeated not on the field but on the production sheet. If you value deep research, forgotten details of history, and the courage to revisit mistakes that cost empires, leave your like and subscribe. This helps us to continue to reveal what the war has tried to hide. For German military doctrine, the Rhine was not just a river, it was a geographical wall, a liquid fortress carved by nature and consecrated by centuries of European warfare. With its more than 1,300 feet wide, swift current and unstable banks, it offered what the Wehrmacht strategy manuals called an insurmountable natural obstacle in combat time. After the collapse of the defenses in western France and the Allied advance through the Ardennes, the German High Command concentrated its last hope on the Rhine. The order was clear: burn the bridges, undermine the banks, turn every meter of bank into a zone of absolute denial. Each German engineering battalion was called in to reinforce bunkers, recalibrate artillery for saturation dams, and study with obsessive attention the failures of past crossings, such as the Soviet one on the Don and the American one on the Seine. The reasoning was logical but linear. Crossings take time. Bridges need to be thrown under fire, and as long as the bridges do not exist, the enemy advance will be slowed. In this logic, the Rhine didn't just separate armies, it bought time. Time to regroup, time to counterattack, time to survive. But there was a fundamental problem. The Germans were studying crossings from the past to counter a crossing that did not yet exist. His assumptions were based on the assumption that the Allies would need to repeat on a larger scale the same movements of Falaise, the Loire, or the Volturno. The concept that a mechanized force could simply floating was laughable. Also in February 1945, a meeting of officers from Army Group B concluded that the most likely crossing would be through the construction of 2 floating bridges under smoke cover in a predictable location. The artillery was instructed to concentrate fire exactly on this type of movement. The Rhine was converted into a trap. But what the German generals didn't know is that the Allies weren't planning to cross over. They were planning to ignore it. They were not going to build bridges. They would drive trucks over the water. The underestimation was technical, but also cultural. The German view of war valued the engineer as a craftsman of destruction. Bridges would be defeated with precision, battles won by superior calibers, and defenses repulsed with geometric discipline. The idea that the American enemy would win with quantity was treated with disdain. A disdain that ignored numbers like this. In 1944, the United States produced 12 times more motor vehicles per month than the entire German industry combined. An average of 45,000 trucks rolled off American assembly lines as Germany struggled to keep its sabotaged and scattered factories running. This is the difference between an economy focused on victory and one focused on resistance. If this statistic surprises you, Write in the comments, logistics wins. The blind belief in the Rhine as the final bastion was fueled by another factor, the trauma of World War I. In 1918, river crossing was slow, bloody, and predictable. The delay was part of the equation. Germany believed that, even in the face of the Allied advance, the rivers would guarantee the dilation of time, and with it, the hope of a political solution. This faith in the fixed obstacle has become a strategic vice, a vice that prevented the generals from considering that the enemy did not need the bridge. It was enough for him to have something that floated, and enough fuel. German intelligence reports from early March did not even mention the possibility of crossings at multiple points simultaneously. The logic was binary. Either bridges would be built under fire or makeshift barges would suffer catastrophic losses. No report, absolutely none, considered that an entire motorized army could cross the Rhine, driving. It was a doctrinal impossibility, and therein lies the irony. The defense was prepared against the impossible, and so failed in the face of the probable. The doctrine was not defeated by firepower, but by the obsolescence of its own mental model. While German commanders discussed mine density, howitzer calibers, and angles of fire over fixed crossing points, the Allied command reorganized logistics companies and created mobile routes based on tides, current, and buoyancy. The enemy was no longer an army advancing in columns. It was an industry sailing on wheels. A month before the crossing, Hitler had ordered that any attempt to cross the Rhine be repelled with the fury of the German spirit. What he didn't know, and what his generals couldn't conceive, was that when the attack came, there would be no fury that could reach what was unseen. And when the first vehicles emerged from the waters in silence, without a bridge in sight, the only fury recorded in the reports was the fury of confusion. But that was still only the surface of the fault. Because while German doctrine waited for barges and pointers, the American High Command had already developed a completely new idea, a doctrine where engineering did not build paths, it moved over them, and it is in this idea that DUKW was born. Throughout the Allied campaign in Western Europe, German intelligence reports mentioned DUKW amphibious vehicles only 3 times in 6 months. In each of these quotes, the tone was always the same. Utilitarian devices of limited use, restricted to landing on beaches or, at most, to coastal logistical tasks. For the analytical framework of Abwehr and Fremde Heere West, DUKWs did not pose a strategic threat. They were seen as support pieces, an improvised solution for landings in places where the terrain made it difficult to use conventional trucks. This perception was formed in early contacts during operations in Salerno-Anzio and later in Normandy, where DUKWs were employed to unload material in makeshift ports. But the mistake was not in the tactical observation, it was in the strategic extrapolation. Germany evaluated DUKW by apparent function, not latent capacity, a mistake of form that would become fatal. While German reports estimated that no more than 100 units were operating on the Western Front, the actual number exceeded 2,000. This underestimation was not accidental. It was a symptom of methodological blindness. The German war machine was prepared to recognize tanks, calibers, and armor, not hulled trucks. The contempt was also doctrinal. The DUKW lacked significant armament, was not armored, and its 6-cylinder engine, originally designed for urban freight trucks, was considered insufficient for combat conditions. By German standards, shaped by the technical rigor of war engineering, this was not a military vehicle. It was a motorized improvisation. But what the Wehrmacht analysts did not understand is that the power of the DUKW was not in confrontation, it was in continuity. He didn't fight, he connected. It was a walking bridge between the rear and the front line, a liquid logistics link. This technical contempt was accompanied by a moral view of the enemy. The American soldier, to many German generals, represented a well-equipped but tactically inferior troop. And their equipment reflected this belief. Bulky, standardized, overproduced. The DUKW in this imagery was proof of excess, a truck that tried to be a boat, ugly, slow, and fragile. What the Germans did not anticipate is that instead of attacking a point, the Americans would attack a logic, and they would do it with thousands of the same replaceable, ubiquitous machines. German intelligence was based on statistical patterns and patterns of behavior. On previous crossings, such as the Volturno, the Loire, the Seine, the Allies had used Bailey bridges, assault boats, and motorized ferries. The DUKW always appeared as an auxiliary element, never as a protagonist. And for this reason, Wehrmacht reports classified the risk of direct motorized crossing as negligible. The term does not even appear in river defense manuals, not by omission, but by conceptual impossibility. The mistake wasn't just technical, it was mental. And yet the signs were there. At Anzio, the DUKWs had transported ammunition straight from the beach to forward positions without relying on roads. In Marseille, they kept supplies flowing even after the quay collapsed. In Belgium, they braved icy rivers to deliver food to isolated populations. Each of these operations tested the limits of the vehicle, and with each new test, it proved to be more useful, more reliable, more invisible. As the Germans looked at Sherman tanks, Mustang planes, and strategic bombings, they ignored what was sustaining them all: a steady stream of parts, fuel, and ammunition floating on wheels. Reports intercepted by the British in the days leading up to the crossing of the Rhine show that the German High Command still believed that the offensive would depend on 2 main bridges and several bridgeheads established under intense fire. The mental model was the same as in 1917. The war would move through stages, along lines of contention, and across identifiable fronts. The DUKW overruled all these premises. He didn't need to wait for bridges. He didn't need to respect the river line. He didn't need to operate in stages. He could just start crossing. And when it started, there was no possible warning. No German officers reported the approach of assault vehicles. No bridges were detected. No abnormal river activity was recorded. The crossing took place off the radar of doctrine, and for this very reason, it crossed not only the Rhine but the entire model of war that the Germans had prepared. On March 25th, 2 days after the crossing began, a German artillery colonel wrote in his diary a sentence that never reached the High Command: "We were prepared to destroy bridges, but they didn't need them." The DUKW did not appear on the intelligence maps. He didn't cross barriers, he got around them. He did not win by force, but by the absence of resistance, and all this because it was ignored. But to understand how a vehicle considered curiosity became the silent engine of Allied victory, it is necessary to go back even further. To go back to the moment when it was created, not as a weapon but as an almost accidental solution, because DUKW was not born out of a military strategy. It was born out of a civil problem, and this origin is the key to his revolution. The story of the DUKW does not begin on a battlefield, but on a beach on the American East Coast in 1942, with a patrol boat stranded and with no means of being pulled from the sand. Faced with the impasse, civil engineers and Coast Guard officers wondered, what if there was a vehicle that could come out of the water on its own, carrying cargo, and continue rolling on dry land without the need for cranes, ramps, or ports? This question, almost casual, gave rise to a project that, at first, no one took seriously. The first prototype was rejected by Ford, which considered it technically unfeasible, but General Motors saw the opposite: a viable, cheap, and, above all, urgent engineering challenge. In just 38 days, the concept was transformed into an operational vehicle. The name came from GM's internal code: D for the year 1942, U for utility, K for six-wheel drive, and W for rear twin axle. The DUKW was born not as a weapon, but as a truck with a hull, light enough not to sink, tough enough to face rough seas, and simple enough to be produced on an industrial scale. It was essentially a 2.5-ton GMC truck, the Army's workhorse, with a waterproof hull, a rear propeller attached directly to the transmission, and a naval steering system attached to the steering wheel. The most surprising thing was something invisible: a pneumatic system that allowed the driver to adjust the tire pressure from inside the cabin, adapting to the terrain, mud, gravel, water, or asphalt, with a simple movement of the lever. It was the first military vehicle with this feature, decades before it was adopted in modern trucks. The cost per unit, inferior to that of any armored personnel carrier. Production time, less than 3 days per unit. The genius of DUKW was not in the complexity, but in the integration. It didn't require new logistics, as it shared more than 60% of its parts with other GMC trucks. Maintenance could be done by any field mechanic. Their parts ran on the same trains, used the same tires, the same fuel, the same oil. This standardization was the essence of American warfare doctrine: mass functionality, rapid replacement, uninterrupted production. While Germany developed excellent machines with unique components and specialized labor, the United States created standardized, replicable, and simple-to-operate solutions. The DUKW wasn't the best amphibious vehicle, but it was the vehicle that existed in thousands of examples available now. In initial tests, the DUKW surprised even its engineers. In rough seas, it proved to be more stable than conventional boats. In mud, he overcame jeeps and light trucks. On pebble beaches, he crossed where others got bogged down. It was a compromise that did not replace ships or trucks, but connected the two. And this ability to transition was all that modern warfare needed. The DUKW's first appearance in combat was low-key, delivering ammunition off the coast of Sicily in July 1943. Soon after, in Salerno, it began transporting wounded people straight from the beach to hospital ships. At Anzio, it operated under continuous fire, traversing craters and muddy water with unexpected efficiency. But it was in Normandy that their usefulness exploded. While French ports remained under German control, DUKWs supplied troops across unstable beaches, day and night, clockwork accurately. They were too small for targeted bombing, too mobile to be located, and too numerous to ignore. By the end of 1944, more than 21,000 DUKWs had been produced, a number that seemed absurd until its real role was understood. The DUKW was not an assault vehicle, it was a logistical gear. Each of them on average carried 2,500 kilos of cargo per trip. Multiplied by dozens of daily trips, the tactical impact was colossal. In Normandy, a single platoon of DUKWs moved more ammunition in 24 hours than a freight train, but what impressed even more was its durability. Designed for 90 days of use, many operated for more than 2 years. Some crossed seas, rivers, forests, and roads without ever needing new parts. It was the opposite of the German machinery. No armor, no complexity, but almost indestructible in its mission to keep flowing. And it is precisely this flow that in March 1945 would transform the Rhine from a line of defense into a line of supply. Because now, the DUKWs didn't just exist, they were on standby, waiting for the order. Not in 200 units, as the German intelligence service thought, but in 2,000 copies, concentrated in invisible points, ready to start what no general had predicted, the largest motorized river crossing in history. In the Wehrmacht diaries found after the war, a phrase is repeated with slight variations. We expected them to build bridges, not that they drove down the river, but the crossing would not depend only on vehicles. It would require a new doctrine and a commander willing to turn trucks into weapons. And this man was already drawing up the plan. The plan was not born on a map with flags, but on a clipboard covered in logistical notes. The name behind the idea was Lieutenant Colonel William M. Thompson, an officer in the Quartermaster Corps, the least celebrated arm of the American Army, but perhaps the most decisive in the final stretch of the war. Thompson viewed the battlefield as a distribution system. Where others saw natural obstacles, he saw delivery routes. His concept was straightforward, daring, and for many insane. Crossing the Rhine without building bridges, not with speedboats or assault boats, but with a force of self-sufficient amphibious trucks, organized in mobile columns, with the capacity to carry supplies and return with the wounded, creating a complete logistical cycle over an active river. The idea was presented in February 1945 to the command of the 12th Army Group. The initial reaction was one of caution, but there was something in Thompson's reasoning that couldn't be ignored. DUKW had already proven that it worked. All that was left was to turn it into a strategy. While the Germans reinforced each bank of the Rhine expecting bridges, Thompson and his amphibious companies conducted silent exercises on the tributaries of the Meuse in Belgium. They tested currents, simulated landings in fog, timed loads, and figured out maximum operating distances before overheating. They adjusted the tire pressure according to the humidity of the opposite bank. They created, without anyone noticing, a doctrine of river crossing in motion, something that had never been done on a scale. DUKW ceased to be a support and became a protagonist. Each unit was equipped with night signaling, emergency kits, short-range radios, and compartments adapted for specific ammunition. The columns were divided into autonomous cells, capable of operating for up to 24 hours without external support. It was the first time that a transport force had become an indirect fighting force, not firing, but feeding, fueling, and sustaining the offensive before the firing even began. The irony of this story is that the solution was all along in front of everyone's eyes, including the Germans. But no war manual provided that a truck would serve as a ship. No intelligence report predicted that the first attack would not come from the air or bridges, but from water, with wheels. And if you're enjoying unraveling these facts buried by time and hubris, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue rebuilding the true engineering of war. During the March exercises, Thompson watched his DUKWs sailing quietly under moderate current. In his diary, he wrote, "The bridge is an idea of the last century. The river is the road." On this basis, the American command decided to approve the operation, the crossing of the Rhine at multiple points, led by columns of DUKWs under night cover and with coordinated saturation artillery, a plan impossible to be foreseen by any rigid doctrine, and more, impossible to be stopped, because when the crossing began, there would be no way to distinguish between logistics and robbery. The flow would be constant, the combat dynamic, the front mobile. In contrast, the German stance remained static. Reports intercepted days before the crossing show the focus still concentrated on neutralizing temporary bridges and bombing expected crossing points. No mention of DUKWs, no contingency plan for light amphibious vehicles, no idea that the enemy was already literally practicing how to invade, driving over water. But before the first DUKW went down the ramp to the Rhine, there was still one last step, positioning the vehicles without alerting the enemy. A camouflage and mobilization operation that would be in itself a masterpiece of invisible logistics. And that's what comes next. During the days leading up to the crossing, there was no construction of bridges, no overt movement of troops, and no sign of a large-scale river offensive. What happened was silence. An operation that by definition did not exist. The convoys of DUKWs began to move only at night, without headlights, covered by tarpaulins and improvised camouflages, led by soldiers trained to operate in complete visual and auditory silence. During the day, the vehicles were hidden in abandoned barns, orchards, and even inside bombed-out buildings. None of them could be detected by reconnaissance planes. None were on the routes envisaged by German intelligence. Each DUKW has been manually inspected. Each load is precisely calculated to keep the center of gravity low, the difference between floating stably or turning with the first whirlpool of the Rhine. Fuel measured, tire pressure adjusted, propellers tested. No noise, no sign. Meanwhile, the Allied command used a psychological tactic of diversion. It reinforced positions south of Koblenz and north of Düsseldorf, as if the main offensive was going to take place through these routes. Troops were moved on site. Fictitious bridges were simulated. Engineers pretended to assemble structures. It was a shadow war, and the Germans fell completely. The intercepted reports show that the German 1st Parachute Division was sent to the wrong location, expecting a massive frontal assault that would never come. The actual crossing point between Oppenheim and Nierstein did not possess the slightest significant defensive concentration. There in the dark were 400 DUKWs positioned, sealed, fueled, and ready for the impossible. The preparation was not just technical, it was surgical. To cover the noise of the engines at the time of departure, the Allied artillery batteries were coordinated to initiate a saturation barrage 20 seconds before the first vehicles ignited. Each DUKW was ordered to move forward within 5 seconds, creating a cadence that prevented congestion in the water and kept the supply line in constant motion. The artillery, in addition to covering the sound, also visually concealed the initial displacements, creating clouds of dust and smoke that confused observers and German optical sights. Radio command was limited. Signals were sent by infrared flashlights, prearranged codes and dark flags visible only under ultraviolet light. Nothing was left to chance. The operation was invisible because it was born invisible. There were no names on the maps. There were no lines of advance drawn on paper. The drivers themselves received their final objectives just moments before leaving. This maximum compartmentalization of information avoided any type of leak or prior detection. In all, in less than 4 hours, 82% of the DUKWs had already crossed to the East Bank. No bridges were targeted, no convoy was stopped. The Rhine, primed to resist traditional engineering, simply did not react, because there was nothing to react. The enemy was already on the other side. The fortress had been bypassed, and the guards, they didn't even know. The success of the operation was not a matter of luck. It was the result of a completely different mindset. The Germans expected brute force. The Americans delivered invisible precision. Where construction was expected, there was mobility. Where noise was expected, there was silence. Where resistance was projected, there was a vacuum. It was the absolute negation of traditional warfare. In a diary captured days after the crossing, an officer of the 11th Panzer Division wrote, "Nobody saw anything. We only hear the engine, and they were already behind us." And that phrase sums up the strategic chasm that had formed. Americans weren't just crossing the Rhine. They were crossing the concept of war as the Germans knew it. But that was just the opening. Because now that the DUKWs were on enemy soil, they wouldn't just bring in soldiers, they would bring in an entire road. On the night of March 23, 1945, the Rhine seemed to fulfill its centuries-old barrier destiny. Under overcast skies and the constant hum of Allied artillery, the German defenders took shelter in their trenches, awaiting what was always expected of a crossing. Assault barges, inflatable dinghies, tactical smoke, makeshift bridges, and human waves trying to beat the current. But what came? It was silence. On the other side, in the shade of the branches, the first DUKWs began to float. There was no visible tactical formation, no combat cries. The vehicles glided like shadows over the water, protected by an artillery barrage that had no target. It served only as a sound curtain. The Rhine, that same Rhine that for 2,000 years had detained invaders, was now won not by engineers but by drivers. Each DUKW advanced with a distance calculated to the millimeter. In its hull there was no desperate infantry, but logistical precision. Boxes of ammunition, radios, medical equipment, scouts, communications operators, heavy weapons ready to be assembled as soon as they touched enemy soil. Witnesses from the British Black Watch Regiment, stationed south of the main axis, described the scene as ghostly. The artillery lit up the sky with intermittent flashes, but the river remained a dark and motionless mass. No visible dinghies, no propulsion noise. Only echoes, and on the other side silence. A silence that deceived the German observers, who kept their binoculars fixed at the usual crossing points. Where they expected troops crammed into vulnerable beachheads, they would find, hours later, a phantom scatter. American soldiers already established in forward, out of reach, out of default positions, because this was not a crossing in the traditional sense. There was no beachhead, there was no front line, there was movement. Mobility without form, mobility without warning. At 03:17 a.m., a German commander in the central sector radioed the Frankfurt barracks that no crossings have been detected to date. By 03:18 a.m., the first American trucks had left the Rhine behind, advancing with mortar and transmitter charges toward the villages of Bodenheim and Nackenheim. An invisible supply line had been established, and no one on the German side noticed. The doctrine of river defense, built around stopping the enemy as he crosses, simply ceased to exist, because the Americans weren't cruising. They were already on the other side. At 04:22, an American artillery battery was fully assembled 1.4 kilometers from the east bank of the Rhine. The operators had been transported entirely by DUKWs. No bridge, no delay. The Rhine was already operating as a reverse logistics road. You went back and forth along it as if it were a river highway. By the time the first Sherman tanks began to cross over later mounted pontoon bridges, the ground was already secure. There was no fight to conquer the margin, because the margin had already been ignored. The traditional attack model provided for 3 phases: fire suppression, conquest of the bank, construction of the bridge. What happened that night was a dissolution of that sequence. The Americans abolished the conquest phase. They transformed the crossing into a flow. They created a state of invisible presence, impossible to locate, impossible to bomb. A German major, captured hours later in Mainz, would confess, "We thought they were on the other side. We didn't know they were already behind us." The break was not just tactical, it was mental. The logic of static defense based on lines and times was overwhelmed by an enemy that operated outside of linearity. There was no longer any way to predict, nor where, nor when, nor how many. The DUKWs didn't just float, they confused. They were not detected by radar or observers. They passed where there was no surveillance. And more, they returned with supplies, with wounded, with more ammunition. The war had lost its shape, and with it, the German defense would lose its meaning. But perhaps the most impactful was yet to come, because the DUKWs didn't come alone. They paved the way for something even greater, a complete supply system, which would cross the Rhine as if it were an artificial canal. And he was already on the move. The dawn of March 24th brought the Germans a vision that ran counter to all the fundamentals of their defensive doctrine. Columns of American soldiers appearing in locations where, hours earlier, the map indicated total security. Allied troops were sighted at Ginsheim, Laubenheim, and as far as the gates of Mainz, all positions situated miles from the east bank of the Rhine. The first reaction of the High Command was to suspect sabotage or air landing, but there were no paratroopers, no planes, no bridge, just motorized troops that simply were already there. Field reports began to pile up with phrases that mixed incredulity and despair. Enemy armor north of the line with no record of crossing. There was no visible bridge. Infantry advancing with no bridgeheads detected. The German doctrine, built on the logic of stopping crossings, was faced with a paradox: how to block what is not seen, how to defend what is not announced. The idea that the crossing of the Rhine would require methodical construction, under fire, with weeks of preparation, had been extinguished in less than a night. The American war didn't need bridges, it needed access. And access was what the DUKWs delivered, 24 hours a day, without interruption. By 07:11 a.m., a battalion of the U.S. 80th Infantry Division had already established contact with 3rd Army armored units at a point scheduled to be reached just 2 days later. The front line was advancing faster than the campaign maps themselves could record. The Germans, accustomed to anticipating movements based on logistical tracks and roads, found themselves facing an enemy that ignored conventional routes. The war had lost its pattern, and with it, the calculations. The collapse was more than tactical, it was mental. German commanders began to question the very reality of the front. If there were no bridges, how were American tanks behind the lines? If the engineers were not detected, how were the heavy weapons being fired from across the river? The truth was more disturbing than any hypothesis. The Rhine had not been defeated. It had been bypassed by vehicles that German intelligence considered irrelevant. On the morning of the 24th, a German First Army field radio station intercepted American communications detailing the transport of 3,500 troops and 500 tons of equipment in less than 6 hours, all carried out by DUKWs, a volume that, on any other front, would require bridges, cranes, and railway trains. But here all that was needed were wheels and propellers. The comparison is brutal. The production of amphibious vehicles in the United States in 1944 alone was 40 times higher than in the whole of Germany during the entire war. 40 times. If this number surprised you, comment now. Shocking data. Most German generals have never had access to this kind of comparison, and even if they had, they might not believe it, because the mistake wasn't just in the espionage, it was in the imagination. Interrogations conducted with captured German officers on the outskirts of Nierstein reveal a pattern. They all mentioned an advance impossible to map. One of the lieutenants of the 44th Division confessed, "We were trained to react to bridges. When there is no bridge, there is no reaction." This testimony sums up the doctrinal breakdown. Without visible structure, there is no target. Without a target, there is no strategy. And when the enemy offensive behaves like a fluid, molding itself to terrain, time, and silence, the very concept of defense enters into crisis. The war for Germany was no longer a struggle of forces, and it became a race against time, and time was no longer on his side. In less than 18 hours, the American crossing was no longer a military operation. It was a permanent feedback stream, where every vehicle crossing the Rhine brought reinforcements and returned with wounded or updated orders. Logistics had become offensive. The American war functioned as an autonomous nervous system. It did not need rigid centers nor single directions. It was enough to keep the flow. And it is precisely this flow that, in the coming hours, would fuel the final collapse of the Western Front, because the DUKWs now would not only carry infantry, they were clearing the way for the tanks, and the tanks were already on their way. On the morning of March 24th, the sky over Wesel began to hum, not with the sound of lone engines, but with the coordinated roar of more than 1,500 aircraft, C-47s, bombers, gliders. It was the start of Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne launch ever recorded. As the DUKWs crossed the Rhine in silence below, the skies filled with paratroopers from the American 17th Airborne Corps and the British 6th Airborne Division. The offensive, carefully synchronized, aimed at more than capturing positions. It aimed to saturate, to break the logic of reaction, to completely dissolve any remaining German line of command. It was the second act of a symphony of mobility. The DUKWs, already established as a living bridge to the Rhine, now took on a new role, ground air supply. As the paratroopers touched the ground, many still under anti-aircraft fire, the amphibious vehicles were already carrying ammunition, radio, fuel, and even food directly to the landing points. The traditional logistical cycle, where an airborne troop waits days for reinforcements, has been erased. In less than 2 hours, air-launched battalions were receiving logistical support from the water. The Rhine, once an obstacle, was now a fluid link between air, land, and sea. This total integration was the final collapse of the German concept of sectorized warfare. The intercepted reports of German units in that sector show complete disorientation. An artillery captain wrote, "We were ordered to bombard crossing points, but there was no bridge. Then they said that the Americans had launched troops after us. Soon after, we were hit by fire from the east. The front line no longer exists." And he was right. The front line had dissolved. Not because of a lack of resistance, but because of excessive fluidity. The Germans were surrounded not by tanks, but by logistics, by movement, by a doctrine that enveloped them like fog, difficult to detect, impossible to contain. Operation Varsity was not just an airborne operation. It was the anchoring of everything that had been prepared in the previous weeks. The silent crossing of the DUKWs, the tactical disinformation, the constant flow of supplies, the ability to act before the enemy reacted. It was the art of war elevated to engineering, a war where brute force no longer mattered as much as the ability to maintain uninterrupted flow. In numbers, this meant that between the evening of March 23rd and the evening of March 24th, more than 15,000 paratroopers were dropped, more than 4,000 vehicles crossed the Rhine, and more than 6,000 tons of cargo were moved into the German countryside, all without a single port, without a single crane, without a single visible prep day. The German vision of this new reality was one of collapse. An officer of the 2nd Army Corps radioed in a confessional tone, "We have not been able to locate the war. It envelops us on all sides." That was it. The American war no longer announced itself with tanks lined up or massive bombardments preceding the advance. It came before the sound, before the form, and where there was once a river, there was now a mobile distribution system capable of supplying airborne troops, sustaining columns of armor, and returning accurately, all over water. But the scariest thing for the Germans had not yet been revealed, because the DUKWs were not the pinnacle of this strategy. They were just the vanguard. What came after them was what would really end the war. The American industrial machine, now free to cross the heart of the Reich with no natural border to stop it. What started as an odd, makeshift-looking vehicle quickly turned into a logistical system that rewrote the laws of war. The DUKW, with its capacity to carry 5 tons of cargo, could make up to 5 full trips a day between the rear and the front. This meant that in a single 24-hour cycle, a flotilla of 400 DUKWs could move more than 5,000 tons of supplies without using a single bridge, without relying on roads, and without ever interrupting the flow. For the first time, the logistics of war did not bend to geography. She ignored her. The Rhine, which for centuries had served as a natural trench against invaders, was converted into a liquid highway. Over it flowed ammunition, rations, fuel barrels, engineering equipment, and even hot food, kept in thermal containers, delivered directly to the forward platoons. The idea of a centralized supply line was replaced by a decentralized cellular system, where each DUKW was in itself a bridge, a truck, and a dinghy, simultaneously. This new model created a kind of invisible presence. Even when there was no combat, the DUKWs continued to cross the Rhine. When the radios went silent, they followed. When the roads were unusable, they still floated. In certain sectors, especially south of Mainz, the cadence was so regular that American soldiers began to time delivery times based on the sound of engines in the distance. It was as if the war had created its own artificial stream, a supply line that ran parallel to the river, but not over it. Logistics reports show that in the first week after the crossing alone, more than 20,000 tons of materials were transported exclusively by DUKWs. No other system in the war on any front has achieved this level of efficiency with so little infrastructure. For the Germans, this represented the definitive break with the defensive logic. They had bet everything on the destruction of bridges, the bombing of tracks and the interruption of access roads. But how to interrupt what is not fixed? How to destroy a road that floats, moves, disperses, and is never in the same place? American logistics had become a spectre, invisible to the aerial eye, immune to conventional artillery and above all unstoppable. Captured German officers reported that when preparing night ambushes on planned roads, they simply did not encounter traffic. The American supply line was no longer on the maps. She was in the water. This model overrode another traditional rule, the time between advance and refueling. While conventional armies had to stop after a defensive line was broken through to allow supplies to arrive, the Americans did the opposite. The supply arrived with the advance. In certain sectors, ammunition was delivered to the platoons even before the end of the occupation of the villages. The DUKWs sailed in fog, under fire, in absolute silence. They were the extension of the rear operating within the front line. In a 9th Army report, General Simpson wrote, "The supply line crossed the Rhine before the plan said we should cross it. And if logistics, historically, was seen as the Achilles heel of war, DUKW turned it into the engine of the offensive. The Germans expected physical resistance, trenches, armor, concentrated fire, but what they faced was an advance underpinned by something even more fatal: consistency. No matter the time, the weather, or the state of the terrain, supplies arrived. A war machine powered not only by tanks and planes, but by inflatable tires, propellers, and logistical schedules. A letter found on the body of a German officer in the ruins of Biebesheim read, "They do not stop. They come from where we don't expect it. And when we try to answer, they are already at another point." This was no longer a war of maneuvers. It was a war of flow. And this flow would be, in the following days, responsible for feeding the entry of entire divisions into the heart of Germany. Because the DUKW was not just a vehicle, it was the harbinger of an offensive that does not retreat, does not wait, and does not depend on bridges. But the greatest proof of this would come next, when the heavy tanks, weighing more than 30 tons, began to cross east, not by improvised bridges, but by a logistical system that could not be stopped. At 05:42 a.m., on the morning of 24th of March, Sergeant William C. Lander, struck by artillery shrapnel at the east crossing of the Rhine, was carefully placed inside a DUKW fitted with stretcher mounts. Less than 52 minutes later, he was on an operating table at the 45th Field Hospital across the river, receiving transfusion and intensive care. What, in any other war, would have been a fatal journey of hours or days, if only transportation had been available, was, at that moment, a timed route of survival. For the first time, the battlefield was connected to a medical center, not by luck, nor by individual bravery, but by planned logistics. The DUKW, which until then had been the icon of the invisible offensive, now became the direct line between death and survival. Each of these vehicles, when retrofitted, could carry up to 5 wounded lying on stretchers, stabilized by nurses who boarded the east banks under fire, often still with the sound of explosions all around. And they returned in silence, at speed, with lives that until then would have been statistics, no more. This transformation of the DUKW into a floating ambulance profoundly altered the concept of critical time in war medicine. Before, there was talk of golden hour, the first hour after the injury as decisive for survival. But never in any other theater of war had this hour been respected with systematic precision. On the Rhine, it became standard. In reports from the U.S. Army itself, it is estimated that more than 1,700 wounded soldiers were evacuated in less than 60 minutes in the first 72 hours after the crossing. It is a rescue rate never before recorded in combat, with an active presence of artillery. The reason was not a tactical change, but a structural one. For the first time, the rear was moving alongside the front. It was no longer necessary to conquer the land to install a hospital. It was enough to cross. The DUKWs were the new veins of war, bringing life forward and bringing lives backward. Medical teams report, with almost clinical accuracy, the difference this has made. Lieutenant Nurse Margaret Daly wrote in her diary, "They arrived dirty with blood and mud, but still conscious, still hopeful. It wasn't like in Italy where we only saw bodies. Here we saw bright eyes." This change was not emotional. It was statistics. The death rate among seriously wounded at the Rhine crossing has dropped to less than 19%, an impressive figure considering the context of intense combat. For comparison, in previous campaigns such as Anzio or Monte Cassino, the rate exceeded 30%. The difference was in time, and time, for the first time, was in the hands of the engineers. The DUKWs were retrofitted with special supports, reinforced first aid kits, and even oxygen tanks. Some carried combat medics specializing in trauma, others chaplains and assistants to give comfort to the dying. No other vehicle of the Second World War combined so many roles in one body: tactical transport, logistics vehicle, floating ferry, mobile ambulance. They didn't just sustain the advance, they sustained the dignity of the troops. The wounded soldier was no longer left behind, nor carried on improvised stretchers for miles. It was collected, taken to the water, crossed, and treated. Still alive, still a soldier. For the Germans, this reality was invisible, and therefore impossible to combat. In their post-battle analyses, no reports mention any attempt to target the retreating DUKWs. First, because they did not know that they were carrying wounded people. Second, because they didn't even know they were coming back. The unidirectional logic of war, where advance consumes everything and retreat is synonymous with disorder, has been replaced by a logic of circulation, a cycle, a force that advances, stabilizes, fuels, and saves, without pause, without fixed point, without predictable vulnerability. In a particularly symbolic moment, recorded in the files of the 113th Medical Battalion, a DUKW brought 2 wounded, 3 medics, and a shipment of blood plasma at the same time, all in a single trip. That was no longer war. It was a system. It was operational engineering applied to care. Logistics wasn't just winning, it was saving. The advance was no longer a risk to the lives of the combatants, but paradoxically their guarantee, and that would change everything. In captured German camps, interrogations revealed the abyss of perception between the two sides. A captain in the 5th Division reported that the Americans fought as if they had already won. They didn't stop, they were not afraid, and his wounded, they did not die. That was the ultimate impact. It wasn't enough to win. It was necessary to remain whole. And the United States, with its DUKWs, was proving that the war could be won not just with tanks but with time. But what the Germans didn't yet know was that this same structure, now carrying wounded, would soon return to the Rhine, carrying something else. Because the DUKWs were just getting started, what would come next, crossing that same water, would not be soldiers or stretchers. They would be entire armored divisions. On paper, the LWS, Landwasserschlepper, was everything an amphibious vehicle needed to be. Armored, robust, capable of towing speedboats and operating under moderate fire, a jewel of German engineering. The problem was that jewels don't win wars. The LWS was designed by Rheinmetall marine engineers in 1940 as a multi-role transport tractor, combining land propulsion with an efficient hydrodynamic hull. Each unit took months to produce, required high-quality steel, a bespoke engine, and skilled naval welding labor. It was a military vehicle with the cost and time of manufacturing a medium-sized civilian vessel. Result, between 1940 and 1945, just over 100 units were built. Meanwhile, the Americans, with the brutal pragmatism of an industry with no time for elegance, produced more than 21,000 DUKWs using standard GMC CCKW truck chassis, interchangeable engines, retrofitted civilian wheels, and an inline production system that allowed a duck to be assembled every 7 minutes. It was the difference between craftsmanship and automation, between the ideal and the necessary. This contradiction defined the German collapse. Excellence without scale. It wasn't a lack of talent, it was a lack of time, of steel, of the ability to make mistakes and to adjust. The LWS was technically superior in stability and protection, but it was invisible in the field. The few that did operate in regions such as East Prussia were used to tow barges or remove equipment, almost never in direct combat. DUKWs were everywhere, from North Africa to the beaches of Normandy, from the rivers of Italy to the ports of the Pacific, and now on the Rhine. They didn't win by individual performance. They won by massive presence standardization, easy maintenance, and uninterrupted availability. While German engineers calibrated and recalibrated, Americans produced. This reality was so brutal that in 1946, during the interrogations of the US Strategic Bombing Survey, a former director of Speerwerke declared, "We had brilliant solutions, but no factory to replicate them. With each piece, we started from scratch." In industrial terms, this meant that each LWS was almost a prototype. As for the DUKWs, they were multipliable. And therein lies the fact that many still ignore. While Germany spent weeks assembling a single LWS, the US produced in a month more DUKWs than the entire number of Panther tanks manufactured by Germany in 1944. If this surprised you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because that's the real story behind the myth of German technological power. It existed, but it was impractical. Genius did not reach the front line. It was swallowed up by the pace of American production, and this difference was not just numerical, she was philosophical. While the Germans were looking for the ideal vehicle, the Americans were looking for enough. The DUKW was not pretty, it was not armored, he was not powerful, but it floated, walked, carried, came back and repeated, every day, on all fronts. It was the embodiment of American operational doctrine, mobility before perfection, volume before refinement. The LWS, with its bespoke parts and its limited performance to the coast, was a clear example of how elite engineering, insulated from delivery capability, becomes irrelevant in times of all-out war. This disparity reflected what was already becoming evident among the German soldiers themselves. In intercepted letters from the Western Front, there is a recurring tone of frustration. One sergeant wrote, "Our officers promise new weapons that never arrive. The Americans just come always with more." The weight of this constancy was psychological. DUKW didn't need to win a battle. It just needed to be there, always. And being present was what Germany could no longer do. There was a lack of parts, fuel, trucks, tools, and there was a project left. Projects that did not cross the Rhine, that they did not cross borders, that they did not escape the drawing board. In the end, the battlefield did not reward punctual genius. It rewarded the system. And the American system, with its DUKWs, standardized trucks, assembly lines in Detroit and New Jersey, was invincible because it was replicable. The crossing of the Rhine was not just a military maneuver, it was a logistical trial. And in this court, Germany was condemned for excellence without production, for innovation without repetition, for having believed that the war would be won by projects and not by parts delivered. But this difference still had a price to take. Because the DUKWs, now crossing the Rhine in uninterrupted cycles, were about to do something that even their creators did not imagine: transport heavy weapons and modular engineering structures to assemble, in hours, the next phase of the offensive. What would come now was no longer the crossing. It was the complete transformation of the East Bank, from enemy soil to Allied base. And the Ducks were ready for it. Private First Class James Delaney of the 310th Infantry Regiment described his crossing of the Rhine as anticlimactic. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "Imagine a wide, dark river, and you inside a truck. But the truck enters the water and continues walking. No rush, no shooting, no heroism." It was like going to work in New Jersey. This account, almost banal, is the exact portrait of the asymmetry between expectation and reality in that March of 1945. On the American side, the DUKW was not surprising. It was just another cog in the machine. A weird vehicle, half boat, half truck, that did what needed to be done. Nothing more than that. And perhaps precisely because of this, it worked so well. It was not a propaganda weapon, nor an ideological symbol. It was a tool. And tools do not cause a commotion. They fulfill their function. But on the other side of the Rhine, the picture was quite different. Corporal Hans Bruckner of the 17th SS Division was positioned on the heights south of Oppenheim when he saw the first group of DUKWs emerging from the fog. I thought it was an illusion. Trucks that floated. They entered and exited the water without difficulty, as if the Rhine were not there. In his interrogation, he recorded that his commanders took more than 2 hours to understand what was happening. The maps were wrong. The routes planned for the crossing did not match the landing sites. And worse, there were no bridges, no structure that would justify the presence of American troops on the east bank. There were only trucks leaving the river, as if the ground itself had begun to give birth to an invasion. That scene, for soldiers trained in the rigidity of German doctrine, was a break from reality. The war had ceased to make sense. What the manuals called natural barriers were being ignored as secondary streets. At other points, German soldiers report panic and disorganization. In the Ham sector, Captain Kurt Albrecht attempted to organize a line of fire over a supposed pontoon bridge site. When he arrived, he found only wet tracks on the ground. The DUKWs had already disembarked, dropped their cargo and returned. It was like fighting ghosts, he said. We knew they were there, but we didn't know where to aim. We were shooting against the river, but the river did not respond. Meanwhile, on the American side, troops crossed without even dismantling weapons. DUKW allowed this. Men armed with rifles, ammunition and radios crossed the Rhine as if it were a rough stretch of road. Our captain of the 89th Division described the crossing as boring, even monotonous, just engine noise and water against the hull. This difference in perception was not only symbolic, it was structural. For the Americans, the crossing was a logistical event. For the Germans, it was a psychological breakdown. Sergeant Fritz Meinhard wrote in his diary, "We thought that artillery, smoke, boats would come, but there was nothing like that, just trucks coming out of the water." In several cross affidavits, the word most often used by German soldiers to describe the DUKWs is monsters, not in the sense of warlike power, but of a break in naturalness. Those vehicles should not exist, and yet they were there, coming out of the water like unlikely creatures, ignoring the rules the Germans had been taught for years. In the late afternoon of March 24th, with multiple bridgeheads already established, the first war journalists began to record the reaction of the Allied soldiers themselves. Most did not understand the dimension of what had happened. An AP reporter noted that the fighters spoke of the crossing as if they had taken a tram. No one shouted victory. No one celebrated. The Rhine had been crossed as if it were no obstacle. And this naturalization of the impossible was perhaps the most muted triumph of American industry. In the following days, German radio stations were still trying to understand the event. An intercepted bulletin from Cologne on March 25th asked, "Where are the bridges? How did they get there so fast?" But it was too late. The crossing had taken place without the defensive doctrine even having time to adapt. And while the High Command sought explanations, the base watched the dissolution of its certainties. A general of the 7th Army wrote in a confidential report, "We lost the Rhine not because we were defeated, but because we didn't know that it was no longer a barrier." That is the essence of shock. The underestimation of the DUKW, the disdain for the flimsy vehicle, the blind reliance on relief as a shield, all this collapsed not with explosions, but with wheels touching the bank. The impossible did not come with violence. It came with silence, with routine, with logistics, and that was his greatest strength. But, contrary to what they thought, that was not the end of the line. The DUKW still had another role to fulfill, because while the Germans were still counting vehicles on the water, the Americans were already building cities. In the late afternoon of March 25, 1945, amid the constant noise of amphibious engines and the uninterrupted coming and going of supplies, an unusual request arrived at the command of the British 21st Army Group. Prime Minister Winston Churchill wanted to cross the Rhine, not on a bridge, not in an armoured boat, but in a DUKW. He was received with incredulity. The security protocol did not recommend exposing a head of government in still unstable territory. But Churchill accepted no objections. "I have waited years for this moment," he said, according to reports from officials present. With his inseparable cigar between his teeth and a grey military overcoat, Churchill boarded the amphibious vehicle as a worker gets on a tram, without pomp, but with a symbol in his hands. The DUKW set sail from the West Bank in silence, floating through the waters that for centuries had divided empires, cultures, doctrines, and wars. The crossing took less than 10 minutes. But the impact would last for generations. For Churchill, this act was not just a visit to the front. It was a ritual. The Rhine, treated by German doctrine as a sacred line of defense, was now crossed by a statesman in a swimming truck. A banal gesture in appearance, but devastating in meaning, a 70-year-old man in an unarmored vehicle floating into the heart of Germany as if crossing the Thames, and the most impressive, without encountering resistance. No shots, no explosion, no alarm. Just water drifting away around the front wheel of a vehicle designed to carry boxes and soldiers, now carrying the living symbol of Allied determination. German officers captured days later reported incredulity upon learning of Churchill's crossing. A general of the 11th Panzer Division even declared, "If a head of state crosses the Rhine in a truck, then the war is over." And in a way, he was right, because it wasn't about geography or weaponry or heroism. It was about absolute mastery of logistics, initiative, tactical fluidity. Churchill did not cross the Rhine with troops behind. It was crossing a river that had already been absorbed by the American machine. A river that, a few days before, was seen as a sacred barrier, was now nothing more than a scar on the map. The scene was recorded by war photographers and published in newspapers around the world, but few understood the real dimension of the gesture. Churchill's crossing was not an act of bravery. It was a demonstration of irreversibility. When a politician can float down an enemy river in a cargo vehicle unceremoniously, it is because the logic of war has been reconfigured. The landscape, once fortified, was now just transit. The DUKWs had done just that, deconstructed geography as a weapon, turned rivers into corridors, and bridges into relics of the past. At that moment, the Rhine no longer shared anything. It was just a stretch of the way, and Churchill knew it. When he reached the East Bank, he stepped on German soil with a look that, according to witnesses, mixed satisfaction and weariness. There was no speech, just a dry comment. "Now, let's go to Berlin." The phrase, uttered with the authority of one who knew the war had changed shape, sealed what the DUKWs had started. Victory would not only be military, it would be geographical, it would be symbolic, and above all, it would be technical. The image of a prime minister crossing the Rhine in an amphibious truck represented more than daring. It represented the end of the myth of the natural barrier, the collapse of landscape-based defense, the consecration of a war won in the warehouses, in the workshops, in the production spreadsheets. On his way back to the West Bank, Churchill looked at the vehicle that had taken him. He tapped the thin metal of the body twice and, smiling, said to the driver, "Excellent machine. Tell the factory to keep going." That, coming from a man who had disdained so many technical projects in the previous years, sounded like absolution. The DUKW, ignored, underestimated, called weird even by its users, had just loaded the story into its back seat, and it kept floating as if it were nothing. But the war was not yet over, because the Rhine, now conquered, became the starting line for the final march. What would come next would no longer be crossing. It would be occupation. And the ducks were ready to go beyond what they were designed for, because where the water ended, Germany began. By March 26, 1945, 3 days after the crossing began, the eastern banks of the Rhine were already under Allied control. There was no siege, no ceremonial surrender, not even a battle worthy of the name. What happened was an erosion, slow, invisible, unstoppable, of the German defensive logic. And at the center of that collapse, there were no tanks. There were no bombers. There were trucks that swam. The phrase was repeated in the captured diaries of Wehrmacht officers. They crossed paths with trucks. For an army trained to defend lines, bridges, headwaters, the idea that the enemy would ignore all these structures was not only tactically incomprehensible, it was psychologically unsustainable. The Rhine had been, for generations, a divider of worlds. Now it was just another stretch of the logistical route. The words written by Major Otto Schulz of the 51st Infantry Corps reveal the depth of the rupture. "I don't understand how they got here. We have not seen bridge construction. We did not hear the movement of boats. They just were on the other side." The German doctrine, based on the rigidity of the defense zones and the predictability of field engineering, was defeated not by force, but by irrelevance. When the Americans crossed the Rhine without relying on conventional structures, The very concept of a barrier dissolved. And without barriers, there is no front line. Without a front line, there is no defense. And without defense, all that remains is retreat or surrender. American intelligence reports intercepted increasingly chaotic communications between Army Group B commanders and the High Command in Berlin. In one of them, a colonel begs, "We need to know where the bridges are." How are they cruising? The answer, cold and bureaucratic, came hours later. Use aerial reconnaissance. But when the German planes managed to fly over part of the sector, they didn't see bridges. They didn't see ferries. They didn't see anything. Just wet tracks, convoys that sprouted from clearings, and American columns that were already advancing along secondary roads on the east side. It was like fighting an enemy that ignored its own terrain. The war for the Germans no longer had a map. It was no longer logical. This symbolic destruction of the idea of defensibility had profound effects. Troops began to surrender not after combat, but after realizing that they were simply surrounded by forces that had sprouted on the other side of the Rhine. An entire platoon of the 322nd Division surrendered upon seeing a convoy of DUKWs parked inside a forest that until that morning should have been empty. "If they came here with trucks," said one of the prisoners, "then the war is over." This collapse was not a miscalculation. It was the end of a belief, because more than a line of defense, the Rhine was, for many officers, the last symbol. And symbols, when broken, cannot be rebuilt with force. They need faith. And that faith, in March 1945, disappeared. The Allied commanders fully understood the psychological impact of the feat. They did not celebrate with fanfare. They did not raise flags with theatricality. Silence remained the main weapon. The crossing was not just a military operation. It was a message, one that said, "If even the Rhine has fallen, nothing separates them anymore." The irony of this story is that the solution was always in front of them. DUKW was not a closely guarded secret. It was a public piece, manufactured by the thousands, used in Salerno, in Anzio, in Normandy. And even so, he was ignored, underrated, despised. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content, because often what changes the story isn't what shines, but what floats. From a doctrinal point of view, the crossing of the Rhine marks one of the clearest moments in the conceptual collapse of German strategy. Not because of moral failure, nor because of cowardice, but because it is stuck in a vision of war that has not kept up with time. The doctrine of defense in depth, based on fixed lines and staggered resistance, worked as long as the attackers respected the same language. But when Americans decided they no longer needed bridges, that language became a dead language. Germany did not lose the Rhine by numerical inferiority. He lost by anachronism, for trying to win a 20th century war with 19th century maps. An American commander, observing the advance of the forces east of the Rhine, reportedly said, "We did not break through the German defenses, we ignore them." This sentence accurately sums up the impact of the operation. The Rhine was not conquered, it was forgotten. It was overtaken without significant resistance because the resistance expected another form of attack. I expected smoke, boats, floating bridges. Instead, it received axles, propellers, inflatable tires, and a schedule. Because the DUKWs did not operate in war language, they operated in shifts, but there was still more to do, because the Rhine was not the destination. It was just an obstacle overcome not by isolated bravery, but by an industrial gear that every day placed more and more vehicles, parts, soldiers, and supplies on the other side. And while German doctrine was trying to reorganize itself, it was too late. The next American objective was already set, because when the Rhine fell, his eyes turned to the heart of the Reich, for what came after, for what still remained to be taken, and the DUKWs once again would be ahead. The advance that followed the crossing of the Rhine turned into a phenomenon that American strategic reports would describe as continental-scale operational schedule breakdown. The speed obtained was not mere chance, nor an isolated result of tactical superiority. It was a direct consequence of the elimination of the logistical bottleneck that, in previous wars, slowed down any offensive after a great river. Traditionally, the attacker reached the enemy edge, established a minimal bridgehead, waited for the bridges to be built, consolidated the flow of supplies, and only then allowed armored and mechanized forces to advance. This process required 5 to 14 days, under ideal conditions. On the Rhine, the opposite occurred. There was no pause. There was no gap. The American tanks advanced on the same day that the infantry crossed. General Isaac White of the 2nd Armored Division recorded with almost clinical accuracy, "We advanced 50 miles on the 27th. There was no interruption. The amphibious trucks supplied us on the move." It was a historical anomaly, a cross-operation that not only eliminated the logistical backlog, but reversed it, generating immediate momentum. And this momentum, coupled with the German collapse in several sectors, accelerated the war by whole weeks. The post-war conclusions of the Strategic Bombing Survey, the body responsible for quantifying the operational impact of military actions, were unequivocal. The crossing of the Rhine, carried out without bridges and without interruptions, shortened the European war by approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks that, according to estimates of losses in previous campaigns, would have cost between 40,000 and 60,000 Allied lives, and perhaps twice as many in German casualties, both civilian and military. It wasn't just the victory that came earlier. It was death that came later. The math was cruel but clear. Saving time meant saving people, and the DUKW was, essentially, a time machine applied to war. German commanders understood this effect even before the Americans celebrated it. Field Marshal Walter Model, who was tasked with holding Army Group B together, saw his structure dissolve not as a result of a large head-on collision, but as a consequence of speed. Its mobile reserves, already reduced to about 150 operational vehicles, have not been able to move to block the gaps created by the Allied advance. "By the time we got to the assigned position," recalls one of his operations officers, "the Americans were already behind us." It was not incompetence. It was not a tactical failure. It was the simple fact that the enemy now moved with 2 simultaneous supply lines, one over land, one over water, and each DUKW took precious hours out of the equation, hours that Germany didn't have. The impact of this time savings extended beyond the front line. As the Allies advanced at a rapid pace, German units, unable to organize lines of defense, began to surrender in isolation. Entire villages surrendered before the combat when they noticed that American columns emerged from back roads, while others approached by routes that, in theory, should be inaccessible. The sense of inevitability, that nothing could stop the advance, replaced any notion of coordinated resistance, and this inevitability was fueled by the logistical fluidity of the DUKW. Each crossing completed in minutes meant more ammunition, more food, more fuel, more mobility. And mobility was the language that the Germans could no longer keep up with. The time war became evident to the Allied command as well. General Bradley noted, "If we had relied solely on the bridges, the losses would have been catastrophic." He estimated that on a traditional crossing, as many as 50,000 men could die in the first few days of the operation alone, a number based on the traumatic experiences of the Rapido, the Volturno, and the Sena. The difference now was that the attack no longer had to wait for engineering. DUKW has absorbed a function that until then belonged exclusively to bridges, the continuity function. Instead of one choke point, there were dozens of entry and exit points, varying according to the terrain and need. Allied power will no longer be static. It had become continuous. Victory in the strategic field took a different form, the compression of time. A compression that made it impossible to rebuild the German lines, that took their commanders by surprise, that brought down the morale of already exhausted troops. And at the same time, it saved Allied lives, hastened the arrival of the armistice, and lessened civilian suffering in the region. Because the faster the advance, the shorter the bombing period, the less the isolation of populations, the less the destruction of critical infrastructure. The operation that began with amphibious trucks became an era turning point in the very logic of the Continental Campaign. To some extent, the war was ending before it even reached Berlin, because its end had been decreed by the breaking of the last great natural obstacle. When the Rhine ceased to be a barrier, Germany ceased to be defensible, and contrary to what the German strategists predicted, the defeat did not come by exhaustion nor by annihilation, but by overtaking. The phrase recorded by a US Army officer sums up this change. "We gained 3 weeks without asking geography for permission." And it was true. Geography, for the first time in centuries, was completely ignored. But despite all this acceleration, there was an even more impressive element, an element that would reveal not only the ability to move forward quickly, but to keep moving forward even in the face of chaos. Because after the Rhine, the Allies would face another challenge, the industrial heartland of the Reich, the region that should be, par excellence, the most difficult to penetrate. And yet, there too the logic would be broken, because there, once again, the DUKWs and all that they symbolized would be at the forefront. The documents captured after the fall of Army Group H reveal a disconcerting truth. Germany did not lose the Rhine because of military weakness, but because of imagining a war that no longer existed. The German intelligence reports, many written just days before the crossing, are almost archaeological pieces of fossilized strategic thinking. In them it reads that the enemy, after reaching the bank, must establish a minimum bridgehead before initiating any reinforcement operation, or that the complete destruction of the bridges will delay the Allied advance for at least several days. The doctrine was intact, but the world had changed, and Germany did not notice. The error was not one of calculation, it was of imagination. They expected an attacker limited by the same barriers that had always shaped European warfare. They did not conceive for a moment that the enemy possessed more than 2,000 amphibious vehicles, hundreds of specific units for crossings, doctrine refined in years of campaigns, and the industrial discipline necessary to transform cargo machines into tactical instruments. The most revealing thing is not only the official documents, but the testimonies of the captured officers themselves. Colonel Joachim Engelmann of the 1st Parachute Army bluntly stated during interrogation, "We studied their amphibious invasions. We observed their patterns. We concluded that they depended on bridges. The massive use of amphibious trucks was not in any of our calculations." This phrase, so simple, exposes a structural flaw. German intelligence analyzed the past to predict the future, while the US shaped the future with its industry. When the crossing began, all German premises collapsed simultaneously. The artillery was left without fixed targets. Mobile reserves ran out of reaction vectors. Defensive positions designed to protect predictable routes were bypassed by vehicles that ignored roads. And above all, time, which had always favored the defender, began to favor the striker. This conceptual blindness appears strongly in the reports of Army Group H. In February 1945, the official estimate recorded that the Allied forces have approximately 100 to 150 amphibious vehicles at their disposal. The reality was more than 20 times greater. Here, the historical irony crystallizes. Germany did not know what it was up against because it believed that no one would be able to produce so much. A third German officer, arrested during the siege of the Ruhr, confessed to interrogators, "We thought the Americans were like us, limited by resources, forced to choose priorities. We never imagined that they would build everything at the same time." He was referring not only to the DUKW, but to the Liberty ships, the Sherman tanks, the 2.5-ton trucks, the planes that flew over the Rhine every day. American abundance was not just a technical feature, it was a moral weapon. And this weapon found its point of maximum impact at the crossing of the Rhine. To understand the depth of this error, it is necessary to look at the contrast. While the US set up production lines capable of manufacturing hundreds of amphibious vehicles per month, Germany was still trying to preserve its few LWS, excellent but rare amphibious vehicles. German philosophy sought perfection. The American company was looking for a reliable quantity. On the crossing of the Rhine, the philosophy capable of filling the river with numbers won, not the one capable of building extraordinary prototypes. The enemy was defeated before the battle even began, because his premises were wrong, and his industry insufficient to correct them. But the German mistake brings something even deeper, the belief that war would obey the usual rules. The destroyed bridges, for them, were a guarantee of safety. The river, eternal barrier. The margins, familiar terrain. They did not conceive that the enemy would dissolve these rules with a single decision, to turn trucks into ships. The DUKWs, ignored because they seemed irrelevant, became the piece that overthrew the entire defensive logic of the Reich. And this reveals the true nature of defeat. Germany did not lose to a secret weapon. He lost to what he considered banal. She was not won over by the genius of her opponent, but by her own inability to imagine what American industry could produce. That final irony, that of being defeated by the obvious that is not perceived, appeared in the words of a German officer captured near Bocholt. He said, "We didn't expect them to cross the Rhine, we expected them to build bridges." He added, "If we had known they had so many swimming trucks, we would have prepared another defense. But we didn't know. And when we saw it, it was too late." This is the essence of the tragedy that unfolded between March 23 and 26, 1945. Germany prepared for a linear war, but faced a fluid industrial war. He prepared to destroy bridges, but faced an enemy who no longer needed them. He prepared to contain a beachhead, but faced an attack that spread before he was even identified. In the end, the central question was not why did the Americans win, but why couldn't the Germans imagine that they could lose like that? The answer lies in the inability to see beyond one's own limits, and that inability would guide them directly to the next devastating impact, one that would not only end their defense, but redefine the entire logic of continental warfare. Because just after the Rhine, what would come would not be a tactical victory, but the total collapse of a military structure built on centuries of tradition, and this collapse was already beginning to reveal itself. In the weeks following the fall of the Rhine defenses, when the roar of artillery finally gave way to the ragged silence of the devastated cities, the DUKWs continued to circulate. But now, they carried something quite different. No more ammunition, no troops, no more armored vehicles. They carried sacks of flour, cartons of powdered milk, blankets, medicine, and occasionally small bars of chocolate sent by American families. Those same vehicles that had emerged from the darkness on the night of March 23rd, as messengers of the offensive, now arrived on the banks of the Ruhr as instruments of survival. To the exhausted, hungry, and displaced German populations, they were no longer swimming trucks. They were an unexpected stream of life. In Essen, an American nurse from the 51st Field Hospital described an emblematic scene. The children heard the roar of the engines and ran to the water's edge. They called the DUKWs the wagons that come from the river. It was as if they were waiting for a train from another era. The soldiers, many still with the dry mud of the Rhine crossing strapped to their boots, were silent as they witnessed it. The war that the vehicles helped win was the same war that they were now trying to repair. The humanitarian impact of the DUKW spread rapidly through the newly occupied areas. Americans, accustomed to thinking of it as an operational tool, had to reinvent it for completely new tasks. In cities on the banks of destroyed rivers, Koblenz, Bonn, Duisburg, bridges were reduced to arches of twisted metal, and roads were blocked by rubble. The only way to access certain neighborhoods was by water, and there went the DUKWs, gliding through ruins as if they were going through another phase of the campaign. But this time, they carried doctors, supply crews, civil engineers, and even child welfare officers. The historical irony was profound. Vehicles created to ensure victory were now instrumental in securing the lives of those who had been the enemy. Logistics, which had defeated the Reich, now fed its survivors. And little by little, this gesture dismantled the last psychological barriers of the post-war period. Veterans describe this period with a mixture of bewilderment and humanity. U.S. Corporal Joe Morgan wrote, "I have never forgotten the day a girl of maybe 8 years old ran up to our DUKW. She didn't speak English. He just pointed to the supply box and signaled hunger. It was impossible not to give it." Morgan said that several units began to set aside small portions of what they received to distribute to children, even when officially they were not supposed to. It wasn't generosity. It was moral necessity. These accounts are constantly repeated in diaries and letters. German children, once taught to fear or hate the invader, now descended through makeshift ravines on the riverbanks, waiting for the familiar sound of the American engine. Some soldiers remember laughter that sounded for the first time after weeks of war, with small hands waving at an amphibious truck that, weeks earlier, had broken through its most sacred defense. The DUKW turned enemies into human beings again. No speeches, no negotiations, no orders. Just delivering food, water, and the simple idea that the war was really over. Civilian use of the DUKW also expanded to reconstruction tasks. They took bricks, wood, tools and workers to inaccessible areas. Military engineers used them to install temporary drinking water systems in cities where infrastructure had collapsed. In Frankfurt, there are records of DUKWs being used to transport electric generators to hospitals where newborns were at risk. In another case near Wiesbaden, a DUKW served as a makeshift ambulance when the only available road had collapsed. What stands out about these episodes is the continuity, the silent mechanics of peace reusing the gears of war. DUKW never stopped, it just changed loads. Its symbolic function evolved naturally, almost without its operators realizing it. In the end, it became a literal and figurative bridge between two peoples who were still trying to understand what it meant to be alive after the collapse of a continent. The deepest legacy, however, is in the testimonies of soldiers who saw this transition up close. A sergeant in the 79th Division reported that while delivering supplies to a devastated village, he heard a German man say, "You arrived as enemies, but now you arrive as lifeguards." The phrase carried the ambiguity of a world that still did not know how to start over. But it already suggested that the new beginning had begun. The DUKW, functional, simple, almost ugly, had become a symbol of this process. He had crossed the Rhine to overthrow the Reich, and now he was crossing the rivers to rebuild what was left of Germany. It was the same vehicle, but the meaning was different. And that may explain why so many photos from 1945 capture children touching the bodies of DUKWs with curiosity, as if they wanted to feel the materiality of the impossible they had witnessed. All of this reveals an essential point. True American industrial strength did not end with military victory. It continued quietly in the form of assistance, supplies, and reconstruction. The same machine that produced to destroy now produced to sustain. This is where the legacy of the duck becomes deeper than any tactical feat. He didn't just allow him to cross a river. It allowed us to overcome a moral limit, that of seeing the former enemy as someone to be fed, protected, rebuilt. A gesture that German soldiers never forgot, and that American veterans repeated in their memoirs with restrained pride. The war, after all, had been won, but peace needed to be built. And just like on the Rhine, the first vehicle to arrive was the same as always, the DUKW. And as the rivers continued to flow beneath the scars of Europe, one last question arose, one that brings us to the close of this story. How did a simple, underrated amphibious truck manage to transform not only the course of the war, but the spirit of the post-war era? This answer awaits the conclusion. By the time the last DUKW completed its voyage across the east bank of the Rhine, the war was already decided. Not on maps, not in conferences, but in the silent collapse of a doctrine that could not keep up with the speed of the emerging world. Germany had staked centuries of confidence on geography, fixed lines, methodical defense, and he saw all this unravel in front of an industrial machine that did not respect rivers, did not respect distances, did not respect limits. The Rhine was not conquered, it was ignored. The Third Reich was not overthrown by a revolutionary weapon, it was crushed by abundance. There was no sudden genius, no miraculous tactics. There was production. Production that fed armies, sustained fronts, fueled tanks, saved lives, rebuilt cities, and ultimately ended the war weeks earlier than any optimistic prediction would dare to admit. The American victory on the Rhine was the definitive proof that industry is not an adjunct to strategy. It is the strategy itself. And when German doctrine collapsed, it wasn't just because of technical deficiency, it was because it was fighting an enemy it could manufacture faster than it could think. This is the universal lesson of this story. In modern warfare, logistics does not follow strategy, it defines it. It doesn't matter what quality a plan is if it can't be sustained. It doesn't matter how genius a general is if he lacks parts, fuel, transportation, or time. The DUKW, with its slim body and unlikely aesthetics, taught the world that in the 20th century, quantity was not the opposite of quality. It was the prerequisite for victory. This truth is repeated in all fields of history. Whoever controls the flow controls the result. Whoever masters the rhythm dominates the battle. And those who understand that efficiency is worth more than elegance transform geography, the economy, and the very concept of war. The DUKW was the symbol of this transformation, a vehicle that wasn't supposed to change anything, but ended up changing everything. Even the defeated recognized this. In 1946, during official interrogations, a German general summed up the collapse of his army in a phrase that spanned decades, intact in its irony and precision. We were defeated by trucks. Trucks that moved, trucks that floated, trucks that came back with supplies without relying on bridges, roads, or forecasts. Trucks that proved that the war is not won only by steel from the front. It is won by the steel that comes out of the factories. If you value serious research and the search for historical truth, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating fact that history still holds. And write in the comments, what was the most shocking fact for you on this journey down the invisible Rhine? Because although this story has come to an end, the next one is already waiting. And it begins exactly where it ends, at the point where technology, logistics, and human will intersect to redefine the fate of entire nations. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another amazing story.